The cold in Ashmore House in November arrived first in the floors, stone beneath carpet, carpet worn through at the corners, and the particular chill that settled into the bones of anyone who knelt to examine the lower shelves of the estate's account room at 6:30 in the morning, before the fires had been properly laid. Imogen Ashby had been kneeling on that floor for 17 minutes, and she knew it not because she had counted, but because the cold had progressed from her knees to the middle of her shins, as it always did at approximately that interval. She was cross-referencing the household ledger against the wool merchant's invoices from September, which had arrived 3 weeks late and contained a discrepancy of £4 and 11 shillings that no one else in the household appeared to have noticed. The senior footman had initialed the page. The housekeeper had signed the quarterly summary. The estate's nominal manager, Imogen's cousin Gerald Ashby, had reviewed precisely nothing, because Gerald reviewed nothing, and what Gerald did not review eventually fell to Imogen, which was how she had come to spend the 6 o'clock hour on a stone floor in November for the third consecutive morning. She pulled her shawl tighter, set the September invoice against the October entry, and found the error. A duplicate billing for transport from the mill at Crossfield, charged once in September's reckoning, and entered again, quietly, as a freight supplement in October. £4 11 shillings, extracted with the smooth confidence of someone who had done it before and expected it to continue. She wrote the figure in the margin. She wrote the date. She wrote the word duplicate in her careful, level hand, and she drew a line beneath it. And at the edge of that enormous, drafty house, kneeling on a worn carpet with a corrected ledger balanced on her knee, was Imogen Ashby. She had not been invited to the house party that was even now assembling itself in the east wing above her. The footsteps on the ceiling told her that the guests' trunks were being carried up, that at least 3 of the party had arrived by the previous evening's post-coach, and that someone in the second guest room had requested additional coals, because a footman had passed her door twice in the last half hour carrying the scuttle. She had not been invited because she was not, precisely, a guest. She was also not, precisely, a servant. The term Gerald used, when he used one at all, was companion secretary, a construction that appeared in no official household directory Imogen had ever consulted, and that served primarily to explain why she drew no wage, occupied a room 2 floors below the guest wing but 2 floors above the servants' hall, and was expected to manage the accounts, the correspondence, the tenant arrangements, and the household calendar without being offered a seat at either table. She had been doing this for 4 years and 2 months. She closed the ledger, rose from the floor, and pressed one hand briefly against the wall as the blood returned to her knees. Then she picked up the September invoice, folded it with the margin note facing outward, and placed it on top of Gerald's correspondence pile, where he would be required to see it before he could reach his morning post. It would accomplish nothing, it never did, but she wrote it down. She always wrote it down. She was 26 years old, and she had learned early that the only record that could not be disputed was the one made at the time, in one's own hand, with the date clearly visible. The house party, she gathered from the guest list she had been handed to arrange seating for, because Gerald required seating charts regardless of whether Imogen was permitted to be present at the meal, was in honor of a possible business proposition. The estate at Ashmore carried wool-producing tenants across 400 acres, and those acres were in a condition that could charitably be described as neglected and accurately as failing. Gerald had been in correspondence with a ducal estate to the north, Thorncroft, whose agricultural advisors had expressed interest in acquiring the grazing lease on the upper pastures. The Duke himself, it appeared, had decided to inspect the property in person. Imogen had read the correspondence, because she was the one who filed it. His Grace Adrian Cavendish, Duke of Thorncroft, was 34 years old, had held the title for 8 years since his father's death, and ran his estate with a reputation for methodical decision-making that the wool merchants of 3 counties mentioned, with the particular respect generally reserved for men who paid their accounts on time. He had been to Ashmore once before, Imogen noted from the old correspondence, but that visit had predated her arrival by 2 years, and whatever he had thought of the estate then was not recorded in any file she could locate. He was expected at noon. She had arranged the seating chart for 18 guests, and set 3 fires before 7 o'clock. She was in the east corridor straightening the hall table. The brass candlestick had been knocked askew by someone's trunk, and the flower arrangement that Gerald's intended wife, Miss Octavia Pembridge, had ostentatiously commissioned from the Crossfield florist 3 days ago, had shed 4 petals onto the lacquered surface, and was beginning to lean toward the window with the exhausted posture of something that had not been properly watered, when the front door opened, and the Duke of Thorncroft came in from the cold. He was not announced, because the butler had gone to manage the arrival of luggage in the stable yard, and the footman assigned to the door was momentarily absent. Adrian Cavendish stepped into the entrance hall of Ashmore House alone, a dark wool traveling coat across his shoulders, and stood for a moment in the particular stillness of a man who has arrived and immediately begun to assess. The entrance hall was impressive in the way that things are impressive when they are very large and very cold, and have not been properly maintained. The ceiling was high. The plasterwork was chipped in 2 places above the east window. The runner on the stairs had been turned to hide a worn patch, which was the kind of economy that looks, at a distance, like a choice, and reveals itself, on closer inspection, as a necessity. He was looking at the turned runner when Imogen noticed that he had come in. She did not drop the candlestick. She straightened it, set it at the correct angle, and turned to face the door with the composed expression she had developed over 4 years of managing Gerald's house, without being assigned any of the authority that would have made it easier. "Your Grace," she said, "I believe the butler is attending to the stables. I can send someone to him directly, or I can show you to the drawing room myself, if you prefer not to stand in the corridor." He looked at her, not with the dismissive sweep men generally gave the women who occupied the uncertain middle space she occupied, too well dressed for staff, insufficiently fashionable for company, but with the measuring attention of someone who had just registered a piece of information he had not expected to receive. "You can show me yourself," he said. His voice was even. It revealed nothing, which was itself a form of information. She led him to the drawing room, told him fires were laid, and tea would arrive within 10 minutes, and returned to the corridor to finish what she had been doing. She was not going to be undone by a pair of attentive eyes in an entrance hall. She had things to straighten. He watched her go. She had not looked back. She could not have known he was watching. But she moved with the same economy of motion in the empty corridor that she had used when she believed herself observed, which told him something about her that he found himself turning over with more interest than he had expected. Adrian Cavendish had come to Ashmore House because his land advisor, a man named Mr. Silas Fenn, 63, former estate agent for the Duchy of Carlisle, the kind of elder who made enemies through competence rather than malice, had told him that the upper pastures at Ashmore represented the best unimproved grazing land within a morning's ride of Thorncroft, and that acquiring the lease before the estate's problems became fully apparent to the open market was the kind of decision that paid dividends for 20 years. Fenn had also told him, in the same flat voice he used for all assessments, that the estate's nominal manager was a young man of no particular ability who had inherited a competent operation and was engaged in the systematic dismantling of it. What Fenn had not told him, because Fenn had not known, was that someone had been keeping the accounts. Adrian had seen, through the open door of the account room as he passed the corridor, a desk covered in ordered files. He had not gone in. That would have been a liberty. But he had noted the organization, the labeled shelves, the consistent handwriting on 3 separate ledger spines, visible from the doorway. He had noted the worn carpet at the threshold where someone had been crossing it regularly for years. And then he had arrived in the entrance hall and encountered a woman in a gray wool dress, straightening a candlestick, who had told him precisely what his options were, and offered a third one, calmly, as though managing unexpected arrivals was a thing she did before breakfast, which it likely was. He sat in the drawing room and waited for Gerald Ashby to come downstairs. He thought about the filing system he had seen through the open door. He thought about the ledger spines. He thought about the woman who had looked at him without surprise and told him, in terms he could not dispute, that the choice was his to make. He had been managing Thorncroft for 8 years since his father's death, and he had encountered very few people in that time who gave him information that directly, without first calculating its effect on themselves. He had a proposal for Gerald Ashby regarding the grazing lease. He had arrived with the contract terms in a leather case, reviewed and ready to present. But he also had, tucked beneath the lease terms, a separate memorandum from Fenn, prepared on the strength of certain inquiries Fenn had made through a Crossfield solicitor the previous week. The memorandum was short. It concerned a contract of a different kind. Gerald Ashby had, apparently, been attempting to sell the companion secretary's service contract, an arrangement he had established, with some legal ingenuity, as a 3-year term of household management to be transferred at his discretion to another family in the district. The 3-year term had been entered into 4 years ago, which meant it had been quietly renewed without the employee's recorded consent. Fenn had obtained a copy of the original contract through the solicitor. He had also noted, in his handwriting at the bottom of the memorandum, a single line: "The accounts in that house are kept by the woman in the gray dress. The estate manager cannot find the September invoices without her." Adrian had read the memorandum 3 times. He was not a romantic man. He had not been, in the 8 years since his mother died and he had taken the title and buried himself in Thorncroft's management. A man who paid any particular attention to the lives of women he encountered at business negotiations. His mother had been extraordinary, a woman who had run the estate's household with the kind of quiet structural authority that only became visible after it was absent, and her absence was still a weight he carried, not dramatically, but the way a building carries the weight of what it was built for. Steadily, without complaint, in every stone. He recognized structural authority when he saw it. He had seen it in an entrance hall in 17 seconds. He was going to make his proposal for the grazing lease, because that was sound business. He was also going to review the companion secretary's contract with his own solicitor before he left Ashmore House, because the situation described in Fenn's memorandum was one he found unacceptable, and he was not in the habit of leaving unacceptable situations in place simply because they did not, on the surface, concern him. Gerald Ashby came downstairs at 20 past noon, cheerful and imprecise in the way of men who have been charming their way past their own inadequacies for so long that they have stopped noticing the inadequacies. He welcomed the Duke with enthusiasm, offered refreshments that arrived 10 minutes late and were quietly correct in every detail. Imogen's work, Adrian supposed, since the tea tray was the first organized thing he had seen in the house that did not appear to have been arranged by the same woman who had straightened the candlestick, and launched into the grazing lease discussion with the confidence of someone who did not know what was in their own account books. Adrian let him talk. He asked, at the appropriate moment, for the September accounts. Gerald said they were being reviewed. Adrian said he would like to see the reviewed versions before dinner, if Gerald could have them prepared. The dinner that evening was the particular theater of a household attempting to present itself as larger than it was. Miss Octavia Pembridge sat at Gerald's right hand in a gown of pale blue silk, her dark hair dressed with pearls, her voice carrying the easy confidence of a woman who had never had cause to question whether the room would look at her. It would. It always did. She was exactly the sort of woman that houses like Ashmore were designed to display: beautiful, credentialed, certain. She noticed Imogen at the far end of the table, not at the family end, but not at the servants' end either, in the ambiguous middle position that defined her tenure, with the brief, dismissive attention of someone cataloging potential competition and immediately dismissing it on grounds of wardrobe. "Miss Ashby manages the household correspondence," Gerald said, when Miss Pembridge made a point of asking who the woman in the gray dress was. He said it the way one describes a piece of furniture that has become unexpectedly present at dinner. Indispensable, in the administrative way. "How efficient," Miss Pembridge said, and looked at her soup. Imogen ate her soup. She had managed worse. Adrian, across the table and 3 seats down, observed the exchange with the still expression of a man who has noted something in a ledger and is deciding how to classify it. After dinner, when the men had concluded their port and the women had dispersed, Imogen returned to the account room. She had not stayed for the drawing room gathering. She had never been expected to stay, and she had long since stopped treating that expectation as anything other than logistical information. She lit the lamp, opened the October ledger, and spent 40 minutes preparing the clear account summary that Gerald had told the Duke was being reviewed. Gerald had told this to the Duke not because he had commissioned such a summary, but because he assumed, as he always assumed, that Imogen would produce whatever was required before anyone noticed it was missing. She did produce it, she always did. But this time, before she set it on Gerald's desk, she made a copy. She had been making copies of everything for 6 months. She was not certain what she intended to do with them, but she had learned, 4 years ago, that the only record that could not be disputed was the one in her own hand, and she had developed, in the intervening years, a secondary system of documentation that lived in a locked box in her room and contained, in chronological order, every significant decision she had made for Ashmore House that Gerald had subsequently claimed as his own. The box was not an act of defiance, it was an act of arithmetic. She was not going to become less than she was because no one was counting accurately. She set the summary on Gerald's desk and returned to her room and was in bed before the last guests came upstairs. Adrian received the account summary at breakfast, delivered by Gerald with the confident air of a man presenting his own work. Adrian read it in 4 minutes, identified 2 areas where the figures were cleaner than any set of estate accounts he had reviewed in recent memory, and asked Gerald what methodology he used for tracking the monthly tenant receipts. Gerald said he had a system. Adrian said the system appeared to work very well. Gerald agreed that it did. Adrian folded the summary and placed it in the leather case beside the grazing lease. He had, the previous evening, sent a note by his own courier to Fenn at Thorncroft, asking Fenn to prepare the secondary documentation he had requested 2 weeks prior. The documentation was a different kind of contract, a formal offer of employment as household manager and estate secretary, a position that existed at Thorncroft and had been unfilled for 14 months since the previous holder had retired. The position carried a wage, a title, a defined set of responsibilities, and a specific clause Fenn had drafted at Adrian's instruction regarding the right of the holder to review and sign any contract affecting their own terms of service. He was not being sentimental. He was being operational. The person keeping the accounts at Ashmore House was wasted at Ashmore House, and he had 17,000 acres that required exactly the kind of structural management she had clearly been providing for 4 years without credit. He had also, at 7:30 that morning, walked past the account room and found the door open and the room empty, but with the lamp still warm, and a second ledger open on the desk, one that bore a different organizational system than the first. He had not gone in. He had stood at the threshold for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough to register that the handwriting in the open ledger was the same as on the summary Gerald had given him, and that the open page bore a margin note from 3 days prior in a hand that was very clearly not Gerald Ashby's. He had gone to breakfast and said nothing to anyone. The morning's business, a tour of the upper pastures in weather that had turned gray and purposeful, took 4 hours and confirmed everything Fenn's assessment had suggested. The land was good. The management of it was not. The tenant farmer at the northernmost boundary, a man named Halcott who had been farming that land for 11 years, told Adrian, when Gerald had gone to examine a gate further up the fence line and was out of easy hearing, that the drainage in the lower field had been reported to the estate office 3 seasons ago and not addressed, and that 2 neighboring tenants had reduced their holdings rather than continue under the current arrangement. The arrangement being, Adrian said. Halcott looked at him with the steady eyes of a man who has been careful about what he says for a long time. The arrangement where decisions get made slowly and bills get presented quickly, he said. There was better order to it, 2 years ago. Someone was answering letters. The drainage report got a written response, at least. Adrian returned from the pastures and asked, in the afternoon, if he might review the estate's correspondence files for the current and preceding year. Gerald said he would have them brought up from the account room. They arrived in good order. They were organized by date and subject, annotated at intervals with brief notes in the familiar handwriting. The drainage report was there, filed under tenant concerns, with a response drafted in full, a response that had, evidently, never been sent, or had been sent and not acted upon. Beside it, in a hand that had been added later, was a note. Response drafted 14 March. No action taken. Follow-up requested 7 April. Follow-up requested again, 2 June. See also Tenant Ledger, Upper Pasture section, page 31. He turned to page 31. The numbers there told a story that was entirely consistent with what Halcott had described, organized by quarter, cross-referenced to the grazing figures, and concluded with a margin calculation of the cumulative loss attributable to the unaddressed drainage, a figure of £230 over 2 years, arrived at by a method Adrian's own land agent would have recognized and respected. He sat with the file for a long time. He did not attend the afternoon gathering in the drawing room. He sent word with his man that he was reviewing documents and would be present for dinner. Imogen was in the music room. She did not go there often. The music room at Ashmore was in the oldest part of the house, the north wing, where the cold settled earliest, and the piano had not been properly tuned since Gerald's mother had died, and nobody had thought to arrange a tuning. But the piano was there, and Imogen had played since she was 8 years old, taught by a mother who had understood that a woman who could play well could make herself welcome in rooms where she might otherwise be invisible, and the habit of playing was one she had never managed to give up, even when she had very little time for it. She played through the late afternoon, not performing, there was no one to perform for, but working, the way she worked at everything, with precision and without waste. She played a sonata she had been learning for a year, and then, because the afternoon was gray, and the house above her was full of people for whom she did not exist, she played a song her mother had loved, something in a minor key, unhurried and exact. She did not hear Adrian come to the door. He had been passing the corridor on his way back from the east wing, following the sound he had not expected. Music in a house that seemed to have no interest in music, played with the control of someone who had been a student of the instrument for a long time and was not playing to be heard. He stood in the corridor outside the closed door and listened through to the end. He did not open the door. When the music stopped, he waited. He heard the piano bench shift, heard the sound of papers. She had music sheets then, which she had brought herself, and then quiet. He went on to dress for dinner. At dinner, Miss Octavia Pembridge led the conversation with the ease of a woman performing a task she had rehearsed. She was well informed on the subjects she selected, gracious in the specific way that costs nothing, and positioned herself, without any overt reference to it, as the natural center of the room's attention. She spoke to Adrian about the county assemblies, about the families he might know in common, about the music one heard in town. "Is there much music at Thorncroft?" she asked him, with the particular smile that invites a gentleman to reveal himself. "There was," Adrian said, "less so now." He did not elaborate. Miss Pembridge moved on with practiced smoothness. Imogen, at her end of the table, had heard the answer. She did not look at him. She returned her attention to her plate. He was looking at her. She could feel it the way one feels a fire from across a room. Not warmth yet, but the awareness of heat. The next morning arrived with frost on the inside sill of the account room window, which told Imogen that the north-facing glass needed resealing before winter settled in fully. She added it to the maintenance list she kept, the list that Gerald never commissioned and Imogen had never stopped compiling, because it was the kind of thing that, left unaddressed, produced the sort of expensive structural damage that nobody wanted to explain in March. She was at her desk reviewing the tenant receipts for October when she heard footsteps in the corridor, the particular weight of a man who walked with purpose and without hurry. Not Gerald's step. Gerald moved at a brisker tempo when he believed himself observed, and a slower one when he did not. This was even throughout. The footsteps stopped at her door. She looked up. Adrian Cavendish stood at the threshold of the account room in his morning coat, and he was holding the correspondence file she had prepared. He was not holding it the way a man holds something he has been told to return. He was holding it the way someone holds something they have been reading. "The drainage calculation on page 31, he said. "How did you arrive at the quarterly loss figure?" She looked at him steadily. "I cross-referenced the reduced yield from Halcott's ledger against the expected yield per acre, based on the prior 2 seasons, before the drainage problem began, adjusted for climate variation using the county agricultural record. Then I applied the market rate per stone of wool for each quarter." He was quiet for a moment. "That is the method my land agent uses. It is the method that produces an accurate figure," she said. He stepped into the room. He did not sit, The chair on the visitor's side of the desk was stacked with files, as it always was, but he stood, which meant they were speaking at close to the same level, which was unusual in her experience of conversations with men who held titles. "You drafted the letter to the Crossfield drainage contractor in March," he said. It was not a question. Yes. Gerald said he had not received an adequate response from the contractor. "Gerald received my draft of the response," Imogen said. "Whether he sent it is a different question." There was a quality to his stillness that reminded her of a well-built bridge, the kind that does not shift under load because it was built correctly from the foundation. He was thinking, and his thinking was not uncomfortable to sit beside. "How long have you been doing the accounts for this estate?" he asked. 4 years and 2 months. He nodded. He looked at the open ledger on her desk, and then at the labeled shelves, and then at the second ledger she had not quite moved before he entered. "I came to negotiate a grazing lease," he said, "and also to make a separate proposal." She waited. She had learned not to rush other people's conclusions when they were arriving correctly on their own. "The position of estate secretary and household manager at Thorncroft has been vacant for 14 months, he said. "It is a salaried position, £400 annually, reviewed at the close of each year. The holder has authority over the account files, the correspondence management, the tenant ledger, and the household calendar. The holder also has veto right over any contract affecting their own terms." He paused. "I have the draft terms in my case. I would ask you to read them before you answer." Imogen set down her pen. She said, "You should know that my current arrangement is governed by a contract." "I know," he said. "The contract is not legally enforceable, as Gerald Ashby has administered it. The renewal was not made with your recorded consent. My solicitor has reviewed the original document." He reached into his coat and placed a folded paper on the corner of her desk. "That is the solicitor's opinion, if you wish to read it." She looked at the folded paper. She had suspected the contract was irregular. She had not known there was a legal opinion that said so in writing. Samals. She picked it up, she read it, all 3 pages, without hurrying. He stood and said nothing. When she was finished, she placed it on the desk and sat with it for a moment, pressing her thumb against the edge of the page. "I would like to read the Thorncroft terms," she said. He produced the second document from his coat and set it beside the first. She read that too. It took 11 minutes. He waited, without visible impatience, which was its own form of information about him. "Clause 7, she said. "The veto right over personal contracts. Does this extend to any amendment of the original terms?" "It does. I would want that explicit rather than implied, a subclause." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, though she was not yet certain what to call it. "Agreed," he said. "And the annual review," she said. "I would want the review criteria specified in writing at the outset, rather than conducted at your discretion." Also agreed. She looked at the window. The frost on the inner sill caught the morning light and held it. Below the account room window, the kitchen garden was empty and gray, and beyond it, the upper pastures were the color of something that needed attention. "I will give you my answer before you leave," she said. "I need a day to consider it." "Of course," he said. He left the account room. She picked up her pen, looked at the October ledger, put the pen down, and picked up the Thorncroft contract again. She read it a second time. The position of the third guest room's window latch was faulty, and the guest currently assigned to that room had mentioned it to the footman, who had mentioned it to Imogen, because the footman understood that things mentioned to Imogen got addressed within the day. She spent an hour on it in the middle of the morning, a question of adjusting the fitting, and was in the corridor outside the east wing when she nearly collided with Miss Pembridge, who was carrying a small arrangement of her own flowers, and was in the act of placing them outside the door Adrian had been assigned. Miss Pembridge looked at the latch fitting in Imogen's hand, at Imogen's dress, and at the door. "The east corridor arrangements are rather inadequate for guests of this distinction," she said, pleasantly. It was the pleasantness of a woman who has decided to be generous to someone she has already categorized as harmless. "The hall table arrangement will be refreshed before dinner," Imogen said. "I'll let the kitchen know you preferred something from the house garden rather than the Crossfield florist. It's a reasonable preference, and we have late winter roses still. Miss Pembridge looked at her flowers, then at Imogen, then at the closed door. "That won't be necessary," she said. "As you prefer," Imogen said, and went back to the latch. She was not going to step aside for anyone. She had been managing corridors longer than most people had been paying attention to what went on in them, and she did not require Miss Pembridge's permission to fix a latch or form an opinion about her own future. The afternoon brought an unexpected arrival. Fenn, Adrian's land agent, who came not by carriage but by horse in the 2 o'clock cold, and who was shown to the estate office where Adrian was reviewing the grazing lease. Imogen, passing the open door on her way to the linen press, heard Fenn's voice, dry, precise, without social decoration, delivering something in a tone that carried the slight elevation of a man presenting evidence he considers important. She did not slow her pace, but she heard her own name. The following morning, at 8:30, she found a note under the account room door, in a hand she did not recognize, or rather, in a hand she could not yet attribute, though the writing was controlled and used no more words than were necessary. It said, "I would value your opinion of the drainage restoration plan, if you have time this morning. Thorncroft, not your Grace, not Cavendish, just the estate name, which was either an abbreviation or a statement." She looked at it for a moment, then wrote on the back of it, 10 o'clock. Account room, IA, and slipped it under the connecting door of the small office adjoining the account room, which he had apparently been given the use of. He arrived at 10. She had the drainage file open on the desk and a clean sheet of paper beside it. They spent an hour and 20 minutes on the drainage problem. He asked questions she had not been asked before, specific, operational questions about the soil gradient and the upstream water source, and the cost differential between two contractor approaches. She answered them accurately and, in 2 instances, corrected an assumption in Fenn's original plan that the figures did not support. He made notes. He did not argue the corrections. He incorporated them without ceremony and moved to the next question. At 11:20, she said, "There is a secondary drainage channel from the upper pasture that runs under the estate road. If that section is not addressed, the main restoration will be undermined within 2 seasons." He looked at the survey map she had spread on the desk. "Where?" She pointed. Her finger was 3 inches from his hand on the map's edge. She did not move it away or adjust her position. The work was the work. "How did you find this?" he said. "Halcott mentioned it in a letter 2 years ago," she said. "It was filed under miscellaneous. I moved it to drainage when I reorganized the files in March." He looked at the map and then at her and said, with the same even register he brought to everything, "You reorganized the files in March." The previous system was organized by correspondent rather than subject. It made cross-referencing very slow. There was a pause in which neither of them said anything. Outside the window, the kitchen garden was still gray, but a thin light had come through the clouds in the mid-morning and was lying flat across the frost-killed herbs. It would not be a warm afternoon, but it was less cold than yesterday. He said, "I would like to show you something." He produced, from the leather case he had brought to the account room, a document she had not seen, a larger estate map, hand-annotated, showing Thorncroft in full. The main house at the center, the home farm to the southeast, the tenanted land spreading north and west in blocks of varying size, each annotated in pencil with yield figures, soil classifications, and a notation system she needed only a moment to read. It was organized by a man who thought about land the way she thought about accounts, not as an abstraction, but as a set of specific, interdependent systems that required ongoing attention and accurate records. She studied it for 4 minutes without speaking. "The notation in the northern section," she said, "the question marks beside the yield figures, those are unresolved discrepancies?" "Unresolved for 3 years," he said. "My previous estate secretary did not identify them before he retired, and Fenn has not had time to pursue them systematically." She looked at the 3 marked sections. She thought about the drainage calculation she had done for Ashmore, the method she had applied, the time it had taken. She thought about 4 years of doing this work in a room 2 floors below the guest wing, for a man who presented her findings as his own and renewed her contract without asking. She thought about Clause 7. "My answer," she said, still looking at the map, is yes. She did not look at him when she said it, because she was still thinking, which was how she did everything. She thought completely, and then she spoke. The subclause on Clause 7, she added. I will want it drafted before I sign. It will be ready by this afternoon, he said. She nodded. She rolled the Ashmore drainage file and secured it with its ribbon. I'll finish the October summary for Gerald before I leave, she said. He will need it, and he won't know where the September invoices went without the cross-reference. That is generous, he said, with a precision she recognized as understatement. It is practical, she said. If the summary is not done, someone will telephone the Crossfield solicitor in February and produce an inaccurate figure, and then there will be correspondence about it for 6 months. I have enough correspondence to manage, without inheriting that one from Thorncroft. He was quiet for a moment. She thought she saw, at the left corner of his expression, something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. No, he said. I suppose you do not. Gerald Ashby did not receive the news well. He received it, specifically, in the estate office at 2:30, with Fenn present as witness, and the invalid contract laid on the desk between them, with the solicitor's opinion folded beside it. Adrian delivered the facts with the even economy he brought to all legal matters, and Gerald moved through the predictable sequence of objections, the inconvenience, the disruption, the question of who would manage the correspondence, the implication that he had relied upon certain arrangements, with the escalating energy of a man discovering that the structure he had been standing on was not as solid as he had assumed. She has no other position, Gerald said. She has nowhere to go. The contract was protective. It guaranteed her a household. It guaranteed her unpaid management of your household, Adrian said. The law agrees with that characterization, Mr. Ashby. I'd encourage you to read the solicitor's opinion before you continue. Gerald read it. The energy went out of him in the specific way of men who have been wrong about something they were certain of. Miss Pembridge, who had heard something of the afternoon's developments through the house's efficient social network, found occasion to cross the entrance hall as Imogen was coming down from her room with the first of her boxes, which was not a large box because Imogen did not own a great deal. I understand you are leaving the household, Miss Pembridge said. Her tone had changed. The generous pleasantness was still present, but underneath it there was something more careful, the recalibration of someone who has misjudged a situation and is revising. I am taking a position at Thorncroft, Imogen said, as estate secretary. Miss Pembridge looked at her. I see, she said, in a voice that had processed several things in rapid order, and was reaching a conclusion she had not expected to reach this week. That is a significant position. It is the position I have been doing for 4 years, Imogen said pleasantly. In addition to this one, she carried her box to the hall. A footman took it from her, because the Thorncroft carriage had arrived and the Thorncroft footman was already at the door. Adrian had sent for it before noon, which was either confidence or preparation, and she had decided it was both. She was 30 miles from Ashmore House before she allowed herself to sit back against the carriage seat and rest her eyes for 3 minutes. The county house at the edge of the district was the site of the quarterly agricultural assembly, a gathering of 23 estate holders, their agents, and a committee of wool merchants from 3 counties who met to review pricing structures, dispute assessments, and conduct the institutional business of the region's agricultural economy. Adrian had attended for 8 years. He had never brought his estate secretary to a formal session. This time he did. He had told Imogen 2 days in advance that he wanted her there. He had not explained at length. He had said, in the morning room over the corrected Thorncroft ledger she had been working through for 6 weeks. The March session will include a dispute about the northern pasture yield figures. You identified the discrepancy. I would like you to present the resolution. She had looked at him across the ledger. The committee expects agents and estate holders. The committee expects whoever produces the work, he said. You produced it. She thought about this for the particular amount of time she gave to things that required complete thought. All right, she said. She had been at Thorncroft for 6 weeks, and in that time she had done the following. Resolved the 3 northern yield discrepancies, incorrectly measured parcels, corrected by cross-referencing the original survey, and 2 generations of tenant records. renegotiated the wool transport contract with the Crossfield merchant for a reduction of 12% by consolidating the collection schedule, identified a duplicate billing arrangement with a fencing contractor that had cost the estate £160 over 4 years, and drafted a revised tenant agreement for the home farm's eastern section that clarified maintenance responsibilities so clearly that the tenant in question had signed it with, according to the head groundskeeper, an expression of visible relief. She had also fixed the account room. At Thorncroft, the account room was larger than Ashmore's, with proper south-facing windows, and a fire that was laid every morning without her having to arrange it, because the household was managed by a housekeeper named Mrs. Deering, who had, on Imogen's second day, knocked on the account room door, come in, looked at the reorganization already underway, and said, "You'll want the fire earlier than 8 then," and arranged it immediately without being asked again. Mrs. Deering was a woman of considerable useful directness, who had managed Thorncroft's domestic operations for 16 years, and had firm opinions about the accounting ledgers being kept somewhere a human person could actually find them. She had shown Imogen where the kitchen garden keys were kept, which account needed watching in January when the coal bills came in, and, without explanation, where the estate's musical archive was stored in the North Music Room, because she said Mrs. Deering did not care who opened it as long as they closed it properly. The peer friend came in the form of Miss Harriet Fenn, Silas Fenn's niece, who resided in the village adjacent to the estate, and had a blunt habit of visiting the Thorncroft Library whenever she felt like it, a liberty granted by long-standing family relationship that no one had ever formalized or rescinded. She had arrived on a Tuesday morning, found Imogen in the library with 3 reference volumes and the county agricultural record, and said, with the directness of someone who has already made up her mind, "You're the new estate secretary. Silas said you corrected his drainage plan. 2 points in it," Imogen said. "He didn't correct anyone's plan in 30 years of practice," Harriet said, and sat down across from her. "I am Harriet Fenn. I intend to ask you several things." They had been, after that conversation, something that Imogen would not yet call friends, but that operated like friendship, a regular Tuesday library exchange, a habit of directness, an occasional walk through the kitchen garden where Harriet said things without softening them, and Imogen found this entirely preferable to women who said nothing at all. It was Harriet who, 3 weeks before the agricultural assembly, said, "You know some of those merchants will not like a woman presenting the analysis." "I know," Imogen said. "And Adrian, His Grace, knows that? He said the committee expects whoever produces the work." Harriet considered this. "That is either a very naive view of how committees function," she said, "or a very deliberate decision." Imogen had thought the same thing. The North Music Room held, among other things, a leather portfolio of handwritten scores. Imogen found it on the 3rd shelf from the bottom, filed between 2 volumes of estate correspondence from the 1790s, which suggested it had been placed there for safekeeping rather than access. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was a woman's, fluid, careful, with the margins annotated in pencil in a different hand that was smaller and more contained. She recognized the smaller hand. She had been reading it for 6 weeks on estate maps and contract revisions. He had annotated his mother's music. Not corrections, observations. Small technical notes that showed he had studied the pieces, that he had played them, or tried to, that he had sat with them long enough to understand what they were doing. She replaced the portfolio on the shelf and closed the music room. She had not intended to stumble onto this. She did not intend to use it. But she had been looking, for some time, at the shape of the wound in him, the house that had been quieter since his mother died, the music room that no one opened, the way he moved through gatherings, as though completing an obligation, and now she understood it more precisely. She told herself this was simply additional information, the way the drainage gradient was additional information. She told herself this for approximately 3 days, and then, on the 4th day, she sat down at the North Music Room piano, which had been recently tuned, she noted, within the last 2 weeks, because someone had arranged it, and played the first of his mother's compositions from memory. She had read through the portfolio twice. She played for 40 minutes, working through the piece methodically, and was on the second movement when she became aware that the music room door, which she had left ajar, was open further than she had left it. She did not stop. She played to the end of the second movement, and then she stopped, not because the music was finished, but because she had said what the music had to say, and continuing would have been padding. The door was open. She straightened her music on the stand. "I found the portfolio on the third shelf," she said, to the open door. "I should have asked permission first." He came in. He was not in his morning coat. He had been outside, she thought, because his boots had the particular quality of boots that have been on estate roads in the early afternoon. He stood and looked at the piano, and then at her, and his face had the contained quality of something that had been held under a great deal of structural weight for a long time, and had just heard a sound it had not expected. He said nothing for a moment. He walked to the piano and looked at the portfolio open on the stand. "She played this one every November," he said. "The second movement specifically. She said it was the right kind of music for the time of year." "It is," Imogen said. "It goes correctly toward the minor, and doesn't try to resolve it too quickly." He looked at her with an expression she could now identify, having seen it build across 6 weeks in the account room, and the library, and the estate map, and the mornings when they sat on opposite sides of the ledger, in a companionable silence that had stopped feeling like professional quiet and started feeling like something else. It was the expression of a man who has identified something he did not know he was looking for and has not yet decided what to do about it, because doing something about it is not the kind of decision made quickly. She picked up the portfolio and held it out to him. "You annotated the margins," she said. "Yes. The note on the fourth bar of the second movement, the harmonic observation. You're right about it." He took the portfolio. He looked at the margin note. He looked at her. His hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady when he took it from her, which was the first uncontrolled physical thing she had seen from him in 6 weeks. "Imogen," he said. She stood up from the piano bench. He was 2 feet away, which, in a music room in November, with the door open, and no one else in the north wing, was a distance that had weight. "We have the agricultural assembly in 3 weeks, she said, not because it was the most important thing, but because she needed to think completely before she did anything that was not reversible, and she was not finished thinking. He looked at her for a moment, with the measured patience of a man who has learned to hold the weight of something while he decides where to put it down. "We do," he said. "I would like to be ready for it," she said. "You are ready for it now," he said, "but 3 weeks is also correct." She picked up the sheet she had been using to read the manuscript notation and placed it precisely on top of the portfolio. Her hands were steady. She was going to be steady. "I'll return this to the third shelf," she said. "Leave it on the piano," he said. "It should not be on the third shelf." She left it on the piano. She went back to the account room and sat down at the desk and looked at the October ledger for approximately 90 seconds before she realized she was not seeing the figures. She picked up her pen. She put it down. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the desk. Then she picked up the pen and went back to work. The Agricultural Assembly convened on a Thursday morning in March in the Assembly Hall of the County House, which was a building that had been constructed for exactly this kind of gathering. High-ceilinged, practical, cold until the fires had been going for an hour, lined with tables at which 23 estate holders and their agents sat in the confident arrangement of men conducting business they had been conducting for decades. Imogen arrived with Adrian and Fenn. She carried a leather case containing the Thorncroft analysis of the northern yield discrepancy, the original survey, the corrected parcel measurements, 3 years of tenant records annotated with specific quarter-day figures, and a summary document of 4 pages that was the clearest presentation of agricultural data she had ever produced, and she had produced a great deal of it. She wore a deep blue wool dress, which was not the gray she had worn at Ashmore. She had bought it 4 weeks after arriving at Thorncroft, with the first month of her salary, and she had done so not as a gesture but as an arithmetic decision. She was going to be in rooms where she would be looked at, and she had decided, clearly and without drama, that she was going to be dressed for those rooms. The committee chair was a man named Lord Whitmore, 70s, titled, "The kind of man who had been at these assemblies since before some of the younger estate holders were born, and who maintained his position not through malice, but through the weight of accumulated institutional habit. He welcomed the Duke of Thorncroft with the warmth reserved for men of established rank, noted Fenn's presence with the neutral acknowledgement due a respected professional, and looked at Imogen with the particular expression of a man confronting something that is not in the program. "His Grace's estate secretary," Adrian said, with the flat clarity of a man presenting a fact. "Miss Ashby will be presenting the yield analysis on the northern parcel question." There was a brief recalibration around the room. Imogen noted it without reading it as hostile. It was the institutional response to something unexpected, not yet opposition, but the suspended moment before a room decided what to make of a piece of information it had not been given time to categorize. Lord Whitmore said, "The committee is accustomed to receiving analyses from the agent." "The analysis was produced by Miss Ashby," Adrian said. "It would be most efficient for her to present it." Lord Whitmore looked at Imogen. His look was the look of a man making a calculation. She held it. She did not arrange her expression into anything apologetic. The man sitting 2 seats to Lord Whitmore's right, the Penmore Estates agent, a man named Carew who had a known and long-standing tendency to question anything associated with Thorncroft on principle, said, "We generally require that the presenting party have some documented standing in the field." Imogen opened her case and removed the employment contract. She placed it on the table where Carew could read it. "Estate Secretary, Thorncroft, 6 months tenure," she said. "I have also managed the full account and correspondence administration of another estate for the 4 years preceding. I can produce references if the committee requires them, but I believe the analysis itself will demonstrate the relevant standing." She said this without heat. She picked up the 4-page summary. She presented it in 22 minutes. She did not rush. She did not perform. She laid each component of the evidence on the table as it became relevant: the original survey, the corrected measurements, the cross-referenced tenant records, the yield figures by quarter, and she explained what the figures showed and why the figures were reliable. At 3 points she was interrupted with questions. She answered each question with the specific page reference and figure, rather than a general reply, and she was not asked the same question twice. At the conclusion, she said, "The corrected figures reduce the assessed discrepancy from £340 to 0. The land is performing exactly as it should. The error was in the initial measurement, which the original survey supports." She sat down. She set the summary flat on the table and placed her hands on it and waited. The room had changed in the way rooms change, when evidence has been presented that cannot be disputed without disputing the evidence, rather than the conclusion. It was not a dramatic conversion. Several of the men around the table were looking at the summary with the expressions of men who would take this particular development home and consider it for some time before altering their public position. Carew had not spoken again. Lord Whitmore was looking at the survey. One of the wool merchants, a man from the Eastern Division named Grantley, who Fenn had told her was the most practically minded man in the room, said, "The consolidation of the collection schedule in the transport contract, that was also your work?" "Yes," she said. "The 12% reduction. How was that achieved?" "Consolidating the collection days from 4 to 2 per month, which eliminated duplicate fuel and labor costs for the merchant. The rate reduction reflected the merchant's saved overhead, not a concession on their margin. They preferred it." Grantley nodded. He looked at Adrian. "You've made a sound appointment, Your Grace." "I know," Adrian said. Lord Whitmore set down the survey. He looked at Imogen with an expression that had moved, slowly and imperfectly, from the suspended assessment of the room's opening to something that was not approval exactly, but was in the vicinity of acknowledgement. "The committee accepts the corrected figures," he said. He did not add anything to this, but he did not look away from her when he said it, which was its own form of information. Adrian pushed back his chair. The room's attention shifted. He stood, which was itself a signal, because the session was not in a part of its agenda that called for people to stand. "I want to make something clear to the committee while the matter is in front of us," he said, in the even tone he used when he had already decided the outcome of something and was informing others of it. "The Thorncroft estate has operated this year at its best figures in 12 years. The yield analysis, the contract renegotiation, the resolution of 4 outstanding tenant account issues, and the correction of 2 contractor billing irregularities that had persisted for over 4 years. This work was done by Miss Ashby. I would like the committee's record to reflect that accurately. He looked at her. He did not look away. I have also asked Miss Ashby to marry me, he said. I want that recorded as well, since several of you will discuss it at dinner this evening, and I prefer the accurate version to be the starting point. The room did not erupt immediately. There was the suspended moment before it could, the moment when 23 people are processing information, arriving faster than social convention has a framework for. Grantley made a sound that might have been a laugh kept very small. Carew looked at the ceiling. Lord Whitmore sat entirely still. Imogen sat entirely still. Adrian looked at her, not with the performance of public declaration, but with the specific, measured look of a man who has made his decision and is holding it, and whose decision is standing in front of her, whether or not she is ready for it. She had known this was coming. She had not known he would do it here. She thought about it. Even now, in a room of 23 people, and 1 wool merchant, and Silas Fenn who was studying the floor with elaborate interest, she thought about it completely before she spoke. Then she said, "The record may reflect that I have accepted." The room did not erupt dramatically. It shifted, the way the assembly hall shifted when a significant piece of business had been concluded that would reorganize everything that came after. Several people spoke at once. Grantley laughed openly. Carew said something to the man beside him that no one could quite hear. Lord Whitmore stood. He was old enough and heavy enough with institutional habit that standing was a deliberate thing, not a casual one. He looked at Adrian, and then he looked at Imogen, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who has been wrong about the category of a thing, and knows it, and is choosing to go on record. "Miss Ashby," he said, "the committee will reflect the correction, and the result." She nodded. She did not smile. She was too busy being completely inside the moment to perform anything adjacent to it. That evening, when the assembly had concluded, and the carriage was waiting, and Fenn had gone ahead to see to some correspondence, and Harriet, who had attended as Fenn's companion for the day, had made her own way to the horses, and was pointedly not in the assembly hall's entrance corridor, Adrian came to stand beside Imogen, where she was reviewing the collected papers, and placing them back in the leather case in their proper order. "The room," she said, still working. "That was not what I expected. The room needed to know," he said. "I could not see a more efficient method." She looked up at him. He was 2 feet away again, and the carriage was outside, and Harriet was pointedly elsewhere. The assembly hall was almost empty. "You said you asked me," she said. "The record reflects that, but in the order of events you have not yet actually asked me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went down on one knee on the assembly hall's cold stone floor, which was a thing he did not need to do because they were alone and the record was already set, but which he did because she had spent 4 years doing necessary work in rooms where nobody looked, and he intended, going forward, to err on the side of being seen. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes," he said, "but because you corrected my drainage plan, and fixed the accounts, and played my mother's composition, and when I asked you to read a contract, you read every word of it, and found the clause I had hoped you would find. You are the only person I have spoken to in 8 years, who makes me want to keep talking." She looked down at him. She thought about the 6 weeks at Thorncroft, and the account room, and the music room, and the map with the annotated northern pastures, and the morning he had come to her door with the correspondence file, and asked about the quarterly loss figure with the careful attention of someone who wanted an accurate answer. "That is an accurate statement," she said. "Is that an answer?" "Yes," she said, "it is." He rose. She handed him the leather case, because her hands were full of the summary pages, and he took it without ceremony, which was how they did most things. They were married in February of the following year in the village church adjacent to the estate, attended by Harriet Fenn and Mrs. Deering and Silas Fenn, and, to Imogen's mild surprise, Lord Whitmore, who came without his wife, and sat in the 3rd row, and did not say very much but was present, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Gerald Ashby sent a gift and did not attend. Miss Octavia Pembridge was, by February, engaged to a baronet from the Western District, who had a properly titled estate and no inconvenient secretaries. Imogen wished them both, honestly and without particular drama, a settled life. The account room at Thorncroft had, by the time of the wedding, been formally redesignated the Estate Management Office, a change Adrian had made at the request of no one, and mentioned to Imogen by showing her the revised household register, with her title printed beside the room's description, Estate Management Office, I.A. Cavendish, from February. She had looked at it for a moment, and then placed it in the correct file. 3 years into the marriage, with the lease of the Ashmore Upper Pastures running smoothly under the restored drainage system, and a tenant at Halcott's farm who had extended his agreement for another decade, Imogen prepared a set of annotated estate management guidelines at the request of 2 neighboring estates whose holders had inquired about the methodology she had applied to the Thorncroft accounts. She wrote them clearly and precisely, organized by subject, with margin notes explaining the reasoning behind each approach. She had the set copied and distributed, and they were adopted, in whole or in part, by 4 estates over the following 2 years. The child arrived in the spring of the 3rd year, a girl, because the world occasionally produces exactly the right thing, named Eleanor, for Adrian's mother. Eleanor, at 14 months, was of the opinion that the account room was an excellent location for pulling papers from shelves and examining them with great seriousness before placing them somewhere entirely different, which was not a methodology Imogen endorsed, but which she met with the patient attention she brought to all operational problems that required a longer solution. It was on a Tuesday morning in the following October, a morning with frost on the inner sill that told Imogen the north-facing window of the nursery needed resealing, that Adrian came into the estate management office to find her at the desk with Eleanor in the crook of one arm, and the winter coal accounts open in front of her, the child conducting a focused examination of a ledger ribbon, while Imogen made a notation in the margin with her free hand. He stood at the threshold and looked at them. She knew he was there. She could feel it the way she felt warmth from across a room, not suddenly, but with the steady awareness of something that had been there long enough to be the ordinary temperature of the world. She finished the notation. She looked up. "The window in the nursery," she said. "I know," he said. "I've arranged the glazier." She looked at him. He looked at her. Eleanor transferred her attention from the ledger ribbon to her father's appearance in the doorway, with the focused interest of someone evaluating new data. Imogen handed him the child and picked up her pen. The coal accounts were accurate to the last shilling. The northern pastures had returned their best yield in 20 years, and the glazier was coming on Thursday, which meant the window would be sealed before the first hard frost. She had been managing the important things for a long time. She had not stopped. She did not intend to.